ever wonder what the future of work will look like? In the Hope at Work podcast, you will be exposed to new workplace norms, modern technologies, and unconventional ideas, all from a positive point of view. You'll never look at work the same way again. Welcome, everyone, to the Hope at Work podcast. Today I have with me Dr. Emily Yarrow. Dr. Yarrow and I actually met at the HR Technology Conference. I actually travel a good amount, and everywhere I go, I am proactively looking for like-minded people that are interested in talking about the world of work and creating a more hopeful narrative. And I met Dr. Yarrow and immediately thought, this is somebody I have to have on the show. The other thing that I'm interested in getting from you, Dr. Yarrow, is more of a global point of view. You probably don't disagree that in the States, we have a bit of a myopic point of view. We think the whole world revolves around us. Turns out it's a much larger world than we realize. And I'm really interested in hearing your point of view from a global perspective as well. But before we get into anything, would you mind introducing yourself to the audience? Tell us a little bit about who you are, what you do, where you do it, and maybe even why you do it.
Sure. But first off, thank you ever so much for having invited me along today to speak not only about my work, but about the idea of hope at work, which links quite closely into the work that I do. I'm a senior lecturer in management and organisations at Newcastle University Business School in the UK. In a prior life, I did have a corporate career where I worked for Scottish Widows, a pensions provider, and Procter & Gamble, before coming back to academia. Now, my work is split into two areas, the teaching that I do and my research. So in terms of teaching, I run a global human resource management master's program where we have students from all around the world. And my research focuses essentially on women's lived experiences of organizational life, inequalities in organizations, as well as the future of work. And really those aspects of my work are all tied together and tied to the idea of hope at work. And what I mean by that is, for me, I see a hopeful future of work to be a more egalitarian and inclusive type of and ways of working. So hope at work for me means creating a better and more inclusive and potentially fairer future for everybody in the world of work on the global stage.
I love that. Okay, wonderful. That's a great start. Just to align, so the way that I define hope, especially in the workplace, is the sincere belief in a better future. I left that a little bit generic purposefully so we could go in a wide variety of directions in terms of how that actually plays out. I think you probably have some more specific areas that you've delved into in your research. But once again, sounds like we're really like-minded. So let's, talk a little bit about how all of this plays out. So when you and I first met, I mentioned, I saw a little bit about your background, that you spent some time at the University of Edinburgh, I believe. And so I lived in Edinburgh for a while and lived in the UK for a while. While I was there, I went to the University of Sussex and studied the psychology of kindness and being at work and loved it. It was so fun to get a refresher on these basic concepts of psychology and understanding, what do people really want from work? But I think I'm also seeing some changes, some evolution about what people expect. That next generation has different expectations. So maybe tell us a little bit about not only the research that you're doing, but the interactions that you have with your students, it sounds like from all over the world. And what is your point of view about what people really want from work and how that's changing and evolving?
Yeah, absolutely. It's a fantastic question. Thank you. And I think it brings together so many different areas. And there are huge debates around different generations want and need from work. And I think the first thing I always say is I always caveat any response with really that we can't generalize. Of course, different people, different individuals will want and need different things from work and from the work that they do, also at different points in their lives. But I think ultimately that most people seek elements of fulfillment from the work that they do. But I think it's also important to distinguish between this idea of living to work and working to live. That we need to have a clear distinction there. And this idea, I think, that different generations want really different things, I think can be in some senses problematic. But also at the same time, there are some key patterns and trends that I see from my students when they're finishing up a master's program, for example, what their expectations are in terms of their employment and their career futures in the global context as well, in terms of what they're looking for from employers. And my sense really is that the younger generation are looking for broader fulfillment and really that integration between work and life. Organizations need to respond to this to really be innovative in how they not only attract talent, but retain talent in their organization. So thinking about the whole person, not just people within the workplace, but thinking about people's well-being, for example, more holistically. I think part of that as well, HR practitioners need to also think about what the future of work looks like for older workers. Given that in the global context, we have an aging population, there are untapped opportunities here for new and different forms and modes of intergenerational working and learning, and people entering the workforce learning some of the skills from maybe those who've spent a longer time in their careers. And I think that's something that's quite exciting. So not just intergenerational learning, but also cross-cultural learning and sharing of experiences to give hope.
Yeah. You just highlighted about 20 topics that I would like to explore. But why don't we start with, you mentioned the term living to work versus working to live. I think that's an intriguing statement. Maybe help me understand how you see that play out. And do you see differences across different cultures and how people approach that particular statement?
Yeah, I think so. I think in some senses it can be a problematic statement. It is in some senses a value-laden statement. When we talk about working to live, in some senses that's an expression of privilege. We find ourselves in a global world where there are many people for whom that is simply not choice. So even to find oneself thinking about what does working to live rather than living to work mean, we have to acknowledge our own privilege in the context within which we find ourselves. So, for example, working to live might simply not be possible for somebody who's a gig worker in the gig economy or someone who's employed on an hourly, very low paid contract. So when we talk about what work means to people, we also have to think about what privileges are inherent in that commentary. On a more personal level, certainly at this point in my career, I've always said that I'm paid for my skills, not for my time. And what does that mean practically or pragmatically? That means for me that I see the value in what I bring to my organization and to my students, and the work that I do isn't necessarily compounded in the time that I spend doing it, but rather in the skills that I bring to the table, which is very different. And for me, in return, I look for flexibility. But flexibility cannot be disentangled from trust. And I think trust really links into a lot of the relationship between employees and organization. When we talk about things like the 4-day week or flexible working or what different generations are looking for, a lot of that, when we deconstruct it, actually comes back to trust. And when we talk about hope and the future of work, one of my hopes, my personal hopes, is that there can be greater trust between individuals themselves and between individuals and the organizations within which they find themselves.
That's great. So trust is a topic that has come up a lot for me personally. We actually had another individual on the podcast recently, and that is his area of expertise is trust. It's so foundational, and it speaks to a lot of the discussion and debate happening right now in the larger media about things like return to office. And some of those organizations are implicitly implying that we don't trust you. You need to be here and physically present for us to believe that you're being as productive as you can be. So I want to come back again to something that you mentioned earlier when you were talking about the integration of work and life. Where is that line between personal and professional? And how do you ensure you're respecting that for some individuals who say, hey, I want to keep that a little bit more separate than others? I'm curious to hear your point of view on that, because I think it's inevitably going to come up.
Absolutely. It's a fantastic question. I think that line between the private and the professional can become quite easily blurred or distorted. But I also think it raises questions around identity at work, in the sense of how much of our own identities do we see to be made up of our work? And that will differ from individual to individual. And I'll use the example of academia or higher education, for where there are many people who really see their work as an integral part of them. And the way in which that plays out is in terms of really there is little distinction between the private, the emotional, the professional. But I think particularly in corporate environments where potentially an individual has less of themselves imbued in work that is in the public domain, I think the importance of good legislation, and that is a very broad term, that protects people is very important. In terms of tracking employees, again, I think that brings us back to trust. I think it's important also, if we talk about employee tracking, and it makes me think of the panopticon of the workplace as well, is thinking about what is that information being used for? Is that actually to help and further engage the employee and support them? Or is it actually to drive more value for the organization and to boost performance? So I think it's not just about what information is collected, but about thinking about why is that information collected and how is it going to be used, and has the appropriate consent been sought?
Okay. I think you just gave me my next newsletter topic of exploring the concept of identity at work and how much you ascribe your work as being part of your identity versus those folks, going back to the gig workers, some of the frontline hourly workers that might say, no, this is not who I am. It's what I have to do to make a living.
This is William Tincup, and I'd like to direct you to a wonderful limited series podcast that Ryan and I recorded live at the ERE Recruiting Innovation Summit. We sat down with 20 recruiting and TA leaders from around the world to hear what today's best recruiters are doing to stay sharp, stay relevant, and stay ahead. It's called The Talent Shift. You'll love it. You'll find the podcast wherever you get your podcasts. Listen, like, review, share. Do you.
Yeah, super helpful. I appreciate your point of view on that. I want to come back to, we were inevitably going to start talking about the future of work, right?
Yes.
My favorite topic. And let's go down the technology path. I actually had another guest on, Ollie Henderson, who is actually using technology to track anything that people do in the workplace for a positive point of view. He's trying to do that to help them when it comes to things like performance reviews and being able to articulate, what have you been doing? What have you been working on? Because over time, we tend to forget that. So he's using AI to actually do that. I think at the end of the day, this is going to sound a little bit strange, but I think the more that we embrace technology, the more human the workplace can become. I think the more we can actually build trust, because we're going to allow technology to do many of the things that humans are responsible for today, and that will free us up. We're also going to have, for lack of a better term, some guardrails set up. For example, Dr. Yarrow, think about scheduling for those frontline workers. If you give those individuals choice and freedom to say, hey, I'm going to give you the ability to influence how you're scheduled, when you're scheduled, being able to ask off without having to engage with human beings, but just let the technology determine whether or not it's okay for me to swap shifts with you next Friday night. In the healthcare space, do we have the same credentials so that you were both allowed to work on that particular unit, on that particular shift? We won't be in overtime. Those are the types of things that, in my opinion, is a good example of how technology will actually help. What's your perspective relative to how the role of technology will continue to evolve our experience at work?
I think that the point where I am in my thinking is that absolutely, I agree with you. I think there are fantastic opportunities to be harnessed from changes and developments in technology. For me, it's about freeing us up from the things that can be automated to enable people to have more time to do the things that they're good at, the things that they love doing, the areas of work where they can add value. And that value comes from what is inherently human, that we can't mimic through artificial intelligence, for example. So things such as emotional intelligence, relational intelligence, and how we interact with other people and the relationships that we build. So that inherent human aspect will, in my view, always be important. So it's thinking about how do we leverage and build value from that human and technology, or human and AI augmentation. So thinking, where can the machines really free us up to do the meaningful stuff?
Right. Because that's what especially the next generation wants, is meaning and purpose at work. I think some of the more tenured generations will put it that way, and I'll put myself in that boat, didn't necessarily have that expectation. It was, hey, we knew that may not be part of what we do every day, whereas the next generation, I think, expects it. And I think, again, that's where technology is going to play a big role in changing that experience. You mentioned earlier that you're in a role today where you're essentially paid for your skills, not for your time. If you think about the way that the world of work is structured for most individuals, I think 80% of the world's workforce is frontline, shift-based, probably paid hourly for their time. Do you think we'll ever get to the point in the future of work where that stops and we say, I'm going to pay you for the deliverable that you provided? Now, again, that is very difficult to do in some industries and not in others. So if I say to you, Dr. Yarrow, I'm going to create a website for you, and you're like, I don't care if that takes 40 hours or 40 months, I'm going to pay you the same amount no matter what. And if I'm an expert at that and I'm super efficient and productive in doing that, and I can do it in a week, it doesn't matter. You don't care. You're going to pay me the same. So again, that may be a little bit of a utopian world where we all do work that we just get paid for what you delivered and it doesn't matter how long it took you. But is that an absolutely unrealistic concept for us to eventually adopt some elements of that?
I think there are elements of that we have already seen in the past when we think about the notion of piece rates or piecework in manufacturing, for example. There are huge issues around that, but also lots of opportunities. I think it's about people's life stages as well. It's a huge question. Will we ever get to that stage where everyone is paid based on what they're doing or their skills? I think unfortunately not. I think there will always be work that simply requires people to spend certain amounts of time doing that. And there will always be roles and types of work that people simply physically need to do. They can't be automated. But I'm cognizant of that this is the Hope at Work podcast. What I'm hopeful about is that actually on a global scale, we know that there are still things such as, unfortunately, modern slavery, the exploitation of child workers, for example. I am hopeful that as changes in technology occur, that these very extremely painful and problematic working conditions will improve for people around the world.
I hope so too. And we've certainly seen that over the last 100 years, significant improvements in working conditions. And the hope is that continues to get better. You talked about the older workers. And I think for most of the world, we're starting to see demographic shifts where we're seeing labor shortages, and those aren't likely to go away anytime soon. In fact, they're going to get exacerbated over time as more and more of the workforce is reaching that point of retirement. And so my question for you, Dr. Yarrow, is how do we engage with that older generation to ensure that we don't end up with significant problems in being able to deliver goods and services in society?
I did some research several years ago for and with the Scottish Government. And as a part of that, we spoke to aging hospital porters who were encountering all sorts of health issues in the workplace as they were aging and in doing their jobs. And I think that the key thing to think about really, again, is flexibility, retraining for different kinds of roles, but also that intergenerational learning piece that I mentioned earlier, to really harness that institutional memory, those long-term learnings for the next generation. But much like the newer generation of workers that we were talking about earlier, it's about flexibility and employers responding to the needs of the workforce. Now, sometimes that might be in terms of physical adaptations to the workplace, but also potentially around role augmentation. But also, I think what we are seeing is attitudinal change around how long people want to work for. And people might choose to take some time off and then go back into work. I think it's really about having an open mind and an open heart and thinking about actually how can we create workplaces that are kind and inclusive for the longer life.
Yeah, in fact, those attitudinal changes have been captured in a wonderful book. I don't know if you've heard about the 100-Year Life.
I have, yes.
Yeah, it talks about how we're going to probably live to be 100. Maybe I won't, but my kids probably will. And so they are going to have to probably work longer. And so they may think about, hey, you know what? I'm going to take a 5 to 10 year sabbatical in the middle of my life versus waiting to the end. And I also recognize I'm going to have to work till I'm 80 or 85, and that's okay. So those changes I think are coming relative to social norms, how technology will influence some of those and maybe enable us to work well into our older years, whereas previously that may have been unrealistic. So I tell you what, Dr. Yarrow, is there anything else that we haven't talked about or tackled that you're really interested in exploring before we end things today?
Sure, thank you. I think a brief question for you, Marcus, really is when we consider the future of work, of course, technology is a key part of that. And I just wondered what your views were on the role of technology in the future of work.
I think technology has the potential to make work more human by removing the administrative burden of a lot of work. I also see it as a bit of a bridge between what people have to contend with today and how their lives can be considerably easier and better in the future. Again, coming back to my definition of hope, the sincere belief in a better future. I think technology is going to play a large role in that. It's going to enable us to be a lot more flexible. You used that word. I think we'll be able to personalize our experiences a lot more. And we're going to be able to focus on those things that we find meaning and purpose in instead of administration and minutia. I am admittedly an optimist, and so not to be overly Pollyanna, there's going to be a lot of challenges. We all have experienced technology when it doesn't work and how frustrating that can be.
Yeah.
But I am very optimistic about how the world of work is going to evolve in the future. And I would love to stay in touch with you, better understand some of the research and data that you're collecting and how that's influencing our opportunity to interact with the world differently in the workplace. So thank you so much for being on the show. Really enjoyed it.
It's my pleasure. And thank you so much for having invited me today. Thank you.
You bet.